Hey, Legal Rebels, this is Tom Martin. I'm the founder of LawDroid, and this is my podcast, LawDroid Manifesto, where I interview legal innovators about how they do what they do. In this episode, I interview Richard Susskind, renowned author, professor, and advisor, whose 4-decade pioneering vision has fundamentally shaped how we understand AI's transformative impact on law and justice, and whose new book is a guide for those perplexed about how to think about AI. Welcome to the LawDroid Manifesto podcast. I'm Tom Martin, your host. I'm absolutely thrilled today to have on Professor Richard Susskind. He needs no introduction, actually, but I am going to give him a bit of one. He's a special envoy for justice and AI to the Secretary General of the Commonwealth, which, by the way, I've actually become a member of 2 years ago, became a citizen of Canada, part of the Commonwealth. And he's also president of the Society for Computers and Law. And 25 years from 1998 to 2023. He was also the technology advisor to the Lord Chief Justice of England and Wales, the author of 11 books. His work has been translated into 16 languages, and he's been invited to speak in over 50 countries. He wrote his doctorate in AI and the law in the mid-1980s, and I'd love to get more into that. But he's also a fellow of the British Computer Society and the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Immensely qualified. I've been an admirer of your work for many years. And we actually met each other for the first time in 2018 at the British Legal Technology Forum, where you chaired a panel discussion between me and Gary Gallen about AI chatbots. It's such an honor to have you on, Professor Susskind. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tom. It's really good to be here and to see you again, if not in person, then through this remarkable technology.
Absolutely. And there's a lot to talk about, especially your book, How to Think About AI, a guide for the perplexed. Timing couldn't be better. There are a lot of perplexed and confused people out there, especially lawyers, wondering how to make sense of this all.
I remain perplexed myself, but hopefully slightly less perplexed than when I first wrote the book.
Yeah, one thing I found, and it's actually one book that I read thoroughly, one of the most recent ones. It's been a while since I've read a book completely, end to end, and really enjoyed it. And, I love the fact in a disarming way that you admit that, in the book that you can't know everything. There's way too much to know, and we're all figuring it out together.
Well, that's right. And part of the message of the book is that the AI community itself doesn't speak with a single voice about where this technology is taking us. So one of the things I try to do is lay out a wide variety of views and sometimes throw in my own position and which I indicate which I believe is most credible. But the book isn't like some of my previous books, which were more polemic, where I had a stall to set out. The purpose of the book is to help the general reader understand this remarkable emerging phenomenon that is AI, which I believe will have enormous impact on humanity and civilization.
Agreed. And the fact that it focuses on how people think about it, I think is critically important, because there are many books that have come out about the specifics, the details, the process. But mindset is everything. And how one thinks about this is actually going to likely it's going to forecast how one actually experiences it and how it comes out to affect our lives.
And there's a key point that much of the current commentary, whether it be about the business impact or the ethical implications or how we might regulate this technology, is very much focused on today's AI. We're in the middle of a very exciting period where this new phenomenon, generative AI, has hit us over the last few years. But there's a strong sense in which many people don't see this as an ongoing story. They see it as the start of a new story. Whereas I try to take readers back to 1950 and walk them through how it is that this set of systems and set of ideas have evolved. And my position is that it's absolutely not the final chapter in the story, what we're seeing today. In fact, it's quite an early chapter. There's much yet to come.
And yeah, that gets missed a lot is that this has been going on. This has been a project that's been going on for quite some time. From Alan Turing to the get together in Dartmouth in
Yes.
1956, I think it was, or 55.
56.
Yeah, it's been quite some time. When I first read it, I was just floored by is the fact that you got a doctorate in AI and the law in the mid 80s. Like it's the backstory on that, how that came about. I'm just so curious about.
So, yeah, it does seem rather early. Even I think it seems rather early. I started studying law at Glasgow University in 1978, Glasgow, Scotland. And after a couple of years, you need to specialize in a particular topic for your final 2 years. So if you do what's known as an honours degree in Scottish universities, you're there for 4 years. So your first 2 years are fairly general legal subjects, and then you opt to specialize. And I specialized in jurisprudence, which is legal philosophy in the broadest of terms. And I also specialized, I took some extra classes in philosophy generally. And so I was interested at just at a very early stage in how people think and interested in great thinkers of the past, interested in how we might bring clarity to complex ideas. That attracted me. I think I was honestly less interested in the substantive law and more interested in concepts in and around the law. It fascinated me to think about ideas such as the bindingness of law, or how judges come to decisions, or how we interpret statutes. And that's all the stuff of jurisprudence. And what happened in my third year, so this was about 1981, I found that we were able, in place of one of our final exams, to write a dissertation on a subject of our choosing. And in one of the textbooks in jurisprudence, I'd become fascinated by the chapter on jurimetrics, which was called the scientific investigation of legal problems. That was the definition then. And this wasn't just computers, this was about using psychology and other sciences and law. But the early days of computing did fascinate me. And I started reading this around the time that IBM launched its first personal computer. And it seemed to me just inevitable that technology, digital technology as we would now refer to it, would have major impact in the way we practice law, in the way we administer justice. And so what I set about doing as my final year project was to write about the impact of computers on the judicial process. And as I started undertaking research in this area, I came across this field of artificial intelligence. And I hadn't heard of it in 1981. And I identified in the world there were 26 articles written on AI and law in the English language, 26 articles. So I read them all and then started delving more deeply into AI, quite interested in the psychological sides as well as the scientific and the philosophical sides. And it really hooked me. So I thought, I'm not really ready to be a lawyer. What I would quite like to do is some serious further study into the way in which AI might be used to improve access to justice, to improve the way legal services are delivered. Now, at that time, there was a man in Oxford. He's still alive, thankfully, but now retired, but a law tutor in Oxford by the name of Colin Tapper. And Colin, in many ways, was the father of computers and law. He wrote both about computer law and the application of computers in the law. And he seemed to me, given also he was a background in legal theory or an interest there, I thought he'd be an amazing supervisor for this project I had in mind, which was to look at the potential and limitations of AI in legal problem solving. So I contacted him, visited him, fell in love with Oxford, and left Scotland for Oxford to undertake this research. So 1981 to 82 was as a very naive undergraduate looking at the subject, and then I had the opportunity, and it's a wonderful opportunity if one's ever given it, to spend 3 years, as I did, thinking deeply about one subject.
And I do find a parallel in that I studied philosophy at Yale, and these questions, especially some that you bring up in your book towards the end in part 5, are fascinating. This is something that we're going to be living with for the rest of our lives, and that our kids are going to, you know, have to find a place to live and work with it. And so those questions are critical about how we do that. And I think that's something that you explore very successfully in your book. And it's interesting to see that the seeds of that were planted in 81.
Very much so. In some ways, more in my work as a philosophy student than a jurisprudence student, although jurisprudence is legal philosophy. But I was completely fascinated by philosophy. We had the opportunity when we studied law to pick some non-law subjects to study. And that's why I chose philosophy, moral philosophy. So I joined this class, I think it was the only lawyer amongst hundreds of people who were doing more general arts degrees. And I really took to it and found it not easy. I found it completely engrossing and actually very difficult. But I enjoyed writing about it and I enjoyed learning about it. And I suppose my main mentor in life was eventually the philosophy professor, the professor of moral philosophy. And the one-on-one sessions I had the opportunity to enjoy with him are unforgettable periods in my own education. This chance as a student who was curious to sit down with someone deeply expert and inspiring is really magnificent. And to some extent, that's what the Oxford and Cambridge tutorial system gives you. It gives you the opportunity, hopefully as a bright young individual, to spend time with some of the finest minds in various disciplines, in all disciplines.
So thank you very much for giving us a hint of your origin story there, because that that is it's critical to understanding how you've arrived at this. But I also want to I want to go a little bit farther back, if you'd indulge us, as my audience expects to go into people's origin stories. And I'd like to know where did you grow up in Scotland?
In Glasgow, on the south side of Glasgow. I'm Jewish. I stayed in a fairly Jewish area. My Judaism was important to me. My dad was a refugee from Germany, from Nazi Germany. His dad was killed by the Nazis. And that very much was a backdrop to a lot of my life, actually, how I look at life and how I tackle problems that I face. So dad was a great man, a great inspiration, and lovely mother as well, very clever. So I lived, and a great brother. We lived in a very stable, happy family in the south side of Glasgow. And we, as a family, had great conversation. And I was the youngest in the family. And so, to some extent, trying to catch up and understand what was going on. But that was a great learning ground. And so, in many ways, was privileged, I think, to have the love of my parents and my brother, and also the intellectual environment in which I grew up.
So it was the two of you. You have one brother. Do you have any other siblings?
No, it was the two of us. Yeah.
For the audience benefit, like what was the south side of Glasgow like then?
Oh, fairly typical suburbia. Dad was a doctor, so we had a nice house, and I went to an independent, that's a private fee-paying school, which is about 5 or 6 miles away. So quite a big part of the life actually was driving into school every morning, and usually 3 days a week my dad drove me in, which was a great opportunity to chat with him, and we had a rota with another family, and 2 days a week this other family drove us in. So actually driving in, as I say, was a nice part of the day. And then traveling back, people who lived in the area, we all got public transport back, and groups of us, some of whom I'm still in contact with today, used to go on the bus, and we had a great time. So a great school I went to as well. Very privileged in that. It was called Hutchison's Grammar School, and most of the time actually it was boys only, and then towards the end it merged with the girls' version of the school. At the time, and I think still academically a very strong school, possibly the strongest school when I was there in Scotland. Very competitive, very bright friends, very strong work. And so a lot, I suspect, that I was able to do in my own research and thinking and still in my writing, the seeds were planted in a first-rate education, quite traditional education.
Did you have any exposure to computers at the time?
Not really. I mean, I was at school till the late 70s. As it happens, my father-in-law was involved with computers at a very early stage, and it was my wife, then girlfriend, when I went round to her house. We used to talk endlessly about computing, so that was another influence on me. But it wasn't the case that we used, for example, computers in school. But I do remember, and I think it was 1973 when I was about 12, uh, and this gives you a sense of the stage of the technology, that a friend had the first pocket calculator in the school. And I just found this completely amazing, that this system, you press some buttons and it could undertake all manner of arithmetic. And at the time, it really was. Obviously, just now, this looks absurd even to say this, but at the time, it was remarkable. And I remember we used to compete for the right to, or the opportunity to use this calculator during the lunch hour. It was just entirely fascinating. So too early, actually, to learn about computing. We did learn a little bit about ones and zeros and digital, but it was too early, as I say, a few years before the personal computer came out.
It's funny when I've talked to a few guests, and it seems like that age, around 11, 12, 10 to 12, there's usually like some kind of exposure to using technology in some way. It
Mm.
could be, a calculator, or early playing around with the Commodore 64 or some type of computer.
It wasn't that. I wasn't one of these kids who'd one of the early computer game systems or one of the very early machines. My inclination at school in terms of the subjects I enjoyed English and physics most, and I was quite good at maths. And so I was always torn between studying something that was language oriented and something that was numbers oriented. And in fact, until the very last moment, I was going to do a joint degree in law and accountancy because I couldn't understand. I couldn't decide which discipline to launch myself into. But I was actually so much better at English, really. So I thought I should continue to work with language.
I really love the story that you had in your book about your experience with your father, who was a dermatologist, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned the drives with him, and in the book you talk about an early experience where you're taking what you've learned about AI and this idea of being
Mm,
able to identify melanoma,
mm.
and then using AI to tackle that problem.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit more about that experience.
Well, remember also, we weren't at that time living in the same city. I'd moved to Oxford, was home fairly regularly, but was completely consumed with the idea of what we now call, or I call, first generation AI systems, expert systems, which are essentially huge decision trees. We call them rule based expert systems. And the dominant, actually, area of research through the 70s into the 80s was medicine. There'd been some remarkable breakthroughs in medical diagnostics, and the idea then of how it was you built an advanced AI system was you sat down with a human expert and you tried to mine the jewels from their heads. You tried to identify how it was that they reasoned in their particular discipline. And you tried to model that. And the way we modeled it was explicitly by building these big flowcharts and decision trees. And sometimes they were weighted because it wasn't quite as simple as saying if symptom X, then diagnosis Y. There were probabilities involved, and there's quite complex probabilistic reasoning models were developed at that time. But it struck me, and it was just in conversation with my father, that in his own area of medicine, which is dermatology, why couldn't we have a system that would ask a series of questions about a worrisome lesion or freckle and identify the probability or the likelihood of it turning out to be a melanoma? And we knew of a whole bundle of variables, the size of the lesion, the color of the lesion, the border of the lesion, whether or not it was irregular, the extent to which it had grown, the extent to which it rose above the surface, itch, and so forth. And I think we started having this conversation, we probably could develop a diagnostic system. So because we knew about 20 variables, that would then require us, though, and we just simply in the end didn't have the data. What we would need is the past data about those instances when a lesion was, and we knew this from the histology, when a lesion was cancerous and what factors were present. And on those occasions when it wasn't cancerous, but similar factors were present. And so we talked a lot about this and speculated a lot about this and spent some time thinking about it. Never developed a working system because we actually didn't have the data. You would need, it seemed to us, a very large body of data from which to identify these factors and their correlations with the eventual results of the histology. But the idea was very clear. It was fun talking about it, and we spoke about it quite a bit. And I didn't give too much thought to it until a number of years ago. My father's since passed away, but my dad sent me a paper that was published in Nature, which is the most prestigious science journal. And it turned out in Stanford University, and this is one of the best known AI systems in medicine, they developed a system that they say could outperform any dermatologist in identifying whether a particular given lesion was cancerous. But what was interesting is it moved from the technique that we were using, which was sit down with an expert, develop a big decision tree, have a go at guessing at the probabilities, trial and error, see how that works, to a machine learning approach where they had, as I recall, something like 127 or 129,000 past images of lesions together with the results of the pathology. And so it was a different model, a different approach. And I remember him sending me that article and saying, oh, this is how you do it. And that was certainly not how we did it in the 80s. We also looked at another technique in the 80s when we were thinking about this called rule induction, which is an early example of machine learning, where what you could do was you could derive a rule base, derive a decision tree from a whole set of data. So if you had enough data about the factors and enough data about the outcomes, the system itself would generate a decision tree that was consistent with all of that data. So it was really funny at that time that how we thought we did AI, that what was central to it was this idea of getting the decision tree. So we were using machine learning in the 80s not to deliver these working systems, but actually to generate decision trees. But again, we just simply didn't have enough data. But what was nice, just with my dad, with whom I got on really well, just chatting through these possibilities. And when I came home from Oxford, telling him the kind of work I was doing, it was nice to try and put in the context of work he'd been doing. But it was really funny when he sent that article to me that eventually was the Stanford article. He said to me, the minute I read that it had 129,000 past images of lesions, he said, I knew it was going to be better than me. And he said, and it's quite interesting that in his lifetime, in his career, he'd only seen a few hundred melanoma, where they're actually relatively rare, even though they're very, very serious and talked about a lot, therefore. But he said he knew immediately that would likely outperform him. So that was, I worked in a variety of ways in AI medicine. When I was writing my doctorate in Oxford, although I was law school, I did some collaborative work with a friend who's working in computing, but I was also given a room to share in the computing laboratory. So there were 7 PhD students in computer science and me. And that was actually very educational for me. Now, one guy in the room was a retired surgeon. He was quite young, actually, but he was working in AI and surgery. We spent a lot of time talking about the similarities between AI and law and AI and surgery. And that it's to some extent echoed in later work I did in the future of the professions.
What I really love about that story with your father is, number one, that you got to have those conversations with him. And I know that when I've had in the past conversations with my father, that kind of shared excitement that you have
that's right.
about this thing that is both inspiring to both of you.
He said something very interesting. It was on the point of there being 129,000 past lesions. He said, I know a lot of doctors talk about their intuition, their gut reaction, their instinct when they see something. He said, but he wasn't sure that he thought that was not just as complex, but his own mini database of past experiences. So when you have a new phenomenon, that's to say a new patient with a new condition, you're consciously or unconsciously, he said, doing a kind of pattern match or partial pattern match with previous patients and conditions. And isn't it funny that to some extent matches some conceptions of how it is that AI systems might work? But it also, to some extent, also demystifies the whole idea of human instinct and human intuition. It may be no more than what a couple of philosophers call holistic similarity recognition. So holistic means you look at the whole thing and you look for, consciously and unconsciously, you look to match it overall with something similar you've seen in the past.
Your dad was right on.
I think he was, actually.
Yeah, and in some ways, what you describe, that pattern recognition, like our understanding of it as being an intuition or gut feel, is just an abstraction of that pattern matching.
Well, some people, I think, and we find this a lot in our research as professionals, again, consciously or unconsciously, like to build up the judgment of the practitioner, and we get that in law, medicine, and audit, for example. And I'm not clear that there is some mystical conception of judgment here. I think it might just be this holistic similarity recognition, this partial pattern matching.
The other reason that I love that story with your father is that it also outlines the history of AI. It shows the transition from good old-fashioned AI, conditional logic, decision trees, to learning, to machine learning, deep learning, and what we have now. And also the concerns that exist around it, which is a good segue to talk about how to think about AI, your book. And
yes, can I just say one thing about the similarities and differences? In the early years of these rule-based expert systems, you mined the jewels from humans' heads. What you're doing in machine learning, in the broadest of terms, is mining the jewels from the data, which is a richer and larger body upon which to rely. But it's still some process by which we extract some kind of knowledge, expertise, insight, rhythms, patterns, regularities from the data. So I conceptually don't see them as entirely different. I see them as on the same continuum. In the early days, we worked with individual humans, try to help them articulate the patterns in their heads. And now we have a far richer source, which is the output and the reflection and the embodiment of so many humans in the data we create.
well, it reminds me of one of the things you said in your book, which is it's hard for us to see beyond the beam. I love the way you put it, by the way, that it's hard for us to see beyond the beam of the headlights of our current understanding of technology, that in some ways that's self-limiting, us having that conception, which you're talking about right now. And I would like to talk about the confusions that you raise in the book. And so the confusions, which I know, and I've heard, voiced by a lot of lawyers, is this kind of, there's a few of them. One is not us thinking. The other is the AI fallacy, which I believe your son developed that idea. If you could talk to us a little bit about these confusions that we have based upon our current understanding of how things work and how that is preventing us in a way from utilizing this to the fullest ability that we can.
Yes. So let's start off with not us thinking. And I should say, just by way of background, and you know this, but Daniel, my son, and I, from 2010 to 2015, worked on a book that came out in 2015 called The Future of the Professions. And he's an economist with a very different angle on all of this from me, but it was a great privilege, probably the greatest privilege of my professional life, to work with my son for years on that book. And it's a long book, together with in the new edition where we've done a new preface. It's about 600 pages. And often when people are talking about the future of legal work and professional work, and I have to say slightly superficially, I just say, well, there's a lot of deep thinking one needs to do before you come to conclusions about the sustainability of professional services as a model. That's why I did that work, or we did that work, to help people think deeply about these issues rather than shooting from the hip. Now, one of the things that used to quite amuse us is when you speak to any professional, they always seem to see far greater scope for AI in professions other than their own. And that's what we're talking about now, or I'm talking about not us thinking. this idea, people do this special pleading. Yes, I can see that it applies in medicine and in audit, but in law, we're very, very, and we see this all the time, this not us thinking. And I'm not too critical of it because I understand that people have spent their lives devoted to working in a particular way. They believe in the current working methods. And so it's not a criticism to say that when people talk in this way, they are wrong-headed. I think it's simply irrational to think that somehow you're lucky enough to be the only occupation that won't be affected by AI. But I do understand why people think in that way. And a big theme of my book is the extent to which how we work is intrinsically important, or whether or not it's just what I call instrumentally important. It's philosophical distinction. This idea of intrinsic importance means something's important for its own sake. And so many lawyers feel that the way they work is intrinsically important, whereas I don't think clients think that. I often say in medicine, for example, people want health rather than doctors. We have a set of ways of lawyers of delivering the outcome clients want. But if we can find a cheaper, quicker, better way of solving clients' legal problems, they will show no loyalty to the traditional way that lawyers work. And so while I understand, and we're talking mainly about lawyers, I suspect, why lawyers greatly value the way they work, I think we need to be open-minded and accept there might be different ways of delivering the output that clients ask for. So not us thinking is this thinking that somehow we're special and very different. Another bias that I talk about, and we talk about in our book together, Dan and I, is this idea of technological myopia. And this is very common. I think every day we all see news, not only of AI doing new things, but we hear research which shows some limitations of AI. And the idea of technological myopia is that it's a short-sightedness where people are evaluating the future potential of AI in terms of today's limitations. Whereas I believe that very few of the current limitations will be limitations for all time. You look at the trillions being invested precisely to overcome these limitations. So people always say things like, but the data is biased. Oh, these systems hallucinate. I don't deny either of these phenomena. But to think that the AI industry isn't moving mountains to try and overcome these issues would be naive. So I think we should expect that these problems will be cracked. So don't somehow contain your thinking about what the technology might do in the future simply because there's been some papers written recently about hallucinations. We have to look at the broad trajectories. I talk about the trajectories a lot in the book because in the early days, and I date AI back to 1950, to the article that Alan Turing wrote when he asked, can machines think? In the early days, first few decades, we saw breakthroughs about every 5 to 10 years. And I don't think it's overstating it to say we're seeing breakthroughs now every 6 to 12 months, not just in the technology, but in the applications and uses. It's moving so very quickly now. And I think if you look at the trajectories, takes us into this idea. I say there's no finishing line. No one in Silicon Valley or China is dusting their hands off and saying, well, we've sorted AI, let's move on to something else now. Quite the reverse. The pace of change is accelerating. The scale of investment is unprecedented. The quality of people involved is remarkable. And so we should expect continuing progress and probably an acceleration of progress. Now, the AI fallacy point is another mindset issue. And that's the idea. You often hear people saying things like, well, of course, a machine can't be creative, or a machine can't exercise judgment, as I touched on earlier. And what I want to do, and Dan and I wanted to do in our book, was say that there are many ways of being, as is someone else's phrase, there's many ways of being smart that aren't smart like us. That's to say, and the fallacy is to think that the only way we can replicate human performance is somehow modeling human thinking and reasoning. Now, that was the way we thought, admittedly, in the 80s. We had these rule-based systems that we thought reflected human reasoning. But these systems today do not reflect the way we work. They've got their own unique characteristics. Oceans of data, unbelievable processing power, clever algorithms. And together, they are delivering remarkable outcomes and outputs, outperforming often human beings, but not modeling or replicating the way we work. And so this tendency to and a lot of lawyers do, if we're talking about lawyers, say, well, hang on a second, I think, I reason, I'm creative, I'm conscious, I'm empathetic. A machine can be none of these things, and therefore my world is safe. We say commits the AI fallacy. Because if you twist your thinking around and you imagine what is it clients want, they don't necessarily want the mechanisms you use to be creative or empathetic or exercise judgments. They're wanting outputs, they're wanting outcomes.
And I think a way that you point out of that trap is your what if AGI thinking, right? Because if you pose that question, then it kind of explodes those limitations and gets you outside of that box of thinking with those restrictions.
That's absolutely right. And if I can just take a step back and explain what this is all about, AGI stands for Artificial General Intelligence. And this is the idea that at some stage, this is the hypothesis, the systems we're developing will match human beings across all cognitive tasks. And there's no doubt in some tasks today, they already outperform us and match us. But what we're talking about is essentially human level performance by these apparently intelligent machines. I prefer to say capable machines because I think intelligence is an attribute of humans. But machines that are as capable, if you will, intellectually as we are. Now, the history of this is interesting, but because before ChatGPT was launched, there was research done where AI scientists were asked, when do you think we might have AGI? And the general view was it was 20 to 40 years away, if ever. This was in 2022. If you ask these same AI people today, most are saying 5 to 10 years. And what I say in my book is that if this happens, this would be the most consequential technological breakthrough in the history of humanity. That suddenly we'll be sharing the planet with systems that are as capable as us intellectually. We're used to the idea in fields and factories of machines outperforming us, and we can live with that. We feel far more threatened by machines that might match our intellectual capabilities, our remarkable brains and minds. And so what I say is that while I'm not committing myself to saying we will have AGI, in my book, and I try to make it very, very clear, I say we should plan for AGI between 2030 and 2035. And often when law firms hear this, they say, well, this is just science fictional stuff. And I say, well, you're all such risk-averse organizations. If AGI comes about, it is so fundamental to the profession, to your clients, to your business model, to your labor model, your operating model, that not at least to have given it some consideration seems to me to be a great dereliction of duty. It's fundamental if this happens. And so one can say what I think is unlikely, but very few lawyers are technologically qualified to make that observation reliably. So that, I say, for governments, for our children, for businesses, right across humanity, we should be asking, what if AGI? What would this mean for warfare? What does it mean for the future of the labor market? What does it mean for the way in which wealth is distributed across humanity? Fundamental questions. But I'm afraid there's lots of people who are just not prepared to think that way. People will say things like, all of this is over-exaggerated. AI will always simply be a tool for lawyers. And I agree with that for the next few years. I think the main impact of AI will be to make lawyers more productive and more efficient. But looking long term, even if it's near AGI, it seems to me that so much of the work of junior lawyers will no longer be needed to be done by human beings. And I find this unarguable, but others, of course, say, well, you don't fully understand what goes on in our law offices, or that's not really what our clients want. They roll out a whole bundle of rationalizations. And a lot of it comes back to this basic point, Tom, that I was mentioning, that people understandably like the way that lawyers work, believe there's moral virtue in working the way we work and having human relations. And they believe that carrying on that way of work is important in and of itself. And I take a different view. I can be persuaded that, for example, in the criminal justice system, we might still want to have juries, even though in due course AI systems might be better at finding the facts. because there's a performative aspect to the jury system. We see an intrinsic importance in juries of our peers assembling in the same point in space and time. But in so much else that's done in law, I think it's to mislead ourselves as lawyers and to underserve clients, not to be striving for better ways of solving their problems. And if you look at the great legal problem of unmet legal need in access to justice, most people in our world can't afford access to lawyers and judges. And so another way of looking at it is this is the only way we're going to sort out this problem of access to justice, because we're not going to sort it out by throwing more lawyers and judges at the problem. So I think we're at quite a fundamental point. And you're right. What I try to do in the AGI thinking is to try and people's thinking, try to encourage people to think more broadly and more generally. Many people just hope they can hold out to retirement before all this stuff happens.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of that too from lawyers. I also want to emphasize the people watching this that there's a wonderful dry sense of humor that runs throughout your book too. For example, you had mentioned that you talked to a group of accountants and had a bit of an out-of-body experience.
It was no, it wasn't. It was actuaries. It was actuaries.
Oh, actuaries. Sorry.
Actuaries are people who make accountants look interesting, as the joke goes. Sorry, accountants.
Yeah, but that, in confronting the very
Yes.
types of resistance that you just mentioned, that on the one hand you explained that you felt that they're in fact the very people that are that are most at risk.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
Humor is interesting. I'm quite lighthearted as a person, and I like humor. I love listening to comedy. Comedy's had a big impact in my thinking. Huge Monty Python fan, for example. Absolutely. I regard a lot of Monty Python scripts as scriptural and can recite huge portions of it. But so they were very clever people being extremely funny in an intelligent way. But one of the things I learned is that you can make very serious points in a more lasting and memorable way by cloaking them in humor. And I don't think my book's a bundle of laughs, but I do try to sprinkle it with side comments and observations that will bring a smile to the face. And that's what you try to do as a speaker as well. You try to be memorable, and humor is memorable. I think it's helpful for people also to not to take themselves too seriously, and that's why I sprinkle these bits of what I hope are lighthearted indulgences throughout the text.
Yeah, well, I definitely appreciated that and connected with that from having talked to people too and gotten similar reactions. One other thing I want to talk with you about from the book in the time we have left is you talk about this distinction between automation, elimination, and innovation.
Yeah,
and a lot of everyone, not just lawyers, worry about this is going to take my job. It's going to, I'm not going to have any work to do anymore. And one thing that I don't know if I could claim to have coined it, but Martin's paradox is that on the one hand, lawyers don't want AI to take their jobs, yet on the other hand, they want it to work push button perfect easily that it could do their job for them. And there's a bit of an irony there.
Yes. But I think that goes back to the point that a lot of the current discussion from lawyers is about the use of AI by lawyers rather than for clients. And I think I make the point in the book, when there's a breakthrough in medicine, people don't ask the question, what does this mean for doctors? They ask, what does it mean for patients? What does it mean for health? But in all the events that I speak at and attend, people are all understandably concerned. What does this mean for the future of the law firm, for the future of the lawyer, for the next generation of law students? These are all good questions. But the law is no more there to provide a living for lawyers than ill health is there to provide a living for doctors. It's not the purpose of lawyers to give lawyers jobs. If we can, the law is our most important instrument of social control. To some extent, our legal systems are broken because the access to justice problem is so grave. And even if you ask leading international organizations, you'll hear from general counsel about the unaffordability and the inaccessibility of legal services. So we have some work to do. It's not that our system is working terribly well. and some people are being rather troublesome about by suggesting AI is used, we have a system that is in grave need, it seems to me, of updating, of upgrading, of overhauling. And at last, we're seeing some technologies that can achieve this. Now, my view is fairly clear on this, certainly in the medium term. If you're entrepreneurial, there are, I think, new opportunities for you in working the legal profession. But if you want to stay as a traditional lawyer, a one-to-one consultative advisor who charges by the hour, I think over the years, clients will move from wanting that to wanting cheaper, quicker, more convenient, more business-like, higher quality services that are delivered through AI. And that is my position. And I think that right across the professions. I think we can maybe crack the global health crisis. We can maybe crack the global educational crisis. So that's why there's great excitement about AI, that many of our biggest problems, we can see a glimmer of a set of solutions there. Some people think this is just fanciful, but looking at the trajectories, looking at the rapidity of the advance in the technology, I think it's far more likely than not that we'll get to some near-age AI over the next decade than what I call the hype hypothesis, which are those people who say, and there are many, who say this is just all overblown, the bubble's going to burst and we'll go back to normal.
A lot of times when these discussions happen, people they bring out Jevons paradox, right? And they point to past examples, as I have myself, that an ATM, for example, that tellers were worried that it would take their jobs, but actually, given the fact that it made running a bank less costly, that more banks were opened in different, more branch offices were opened, and therefore there was actually like a net growth in the number of tellers. The idea of making some resource more efficient actually drives more demand. And I guess I just wanted to question that for a second and see what your thoughts are on that. Is AI fundamentally different in the sense that it can actually thwart Jevons paradox and provide the thing in such an efficient way that it bypasses the need for human beings?
I can I go back to, sorry, I didn't answer your earlier question, or clarify the issue between automation, innovation, and elimination. Let me talk about that because that's part of the answer.
Yeah.
And the illustration I give of that is in surgery. That, long story short, I gave a talk to 2,000 neurosurgeons, and they asked me to be controversial about the future. My opening line was, as I've hinted, patients don't want neurosurgeons, they want health. And I said, for a particular type of health problem, you are the best answer we've got today, and thank goodness for your work. But I said, do you not think in 20 or 30 years' time, I don't know, maybe 10 years' time, but people will look back and think it's unbelievable how often we cut bodies open. Because I said to them that day that the future, it seemed to me, of healthcare was not simply robotic surgery, which is automation. It's non-invasive therapy and preventative medicine. So automation, often called by economists task substitution, runs a little like this. People are doing this right across business and government. Lots of famous papers written in this, where people say, we understand the future of jobs by looking at the job, breaking it down into tasks, and seeing where can we take out a human and plug in a machine. That's automation. That's task encroachment. That's task substitution. And that is the way that almost every lawyer thinks about AI. They think, and that's why they say things like, it can't do what I do, because it's thinking of a task it can't do. Non-invasive therapy is entirely different. This is the idea that you deliver the outcome the patient wants in a way that's literally less invasive, less intrusive. It's cheaper, it's quicker, it causes less upset and upheaval. And what I say to lawyers is we have to think not just about how do you automate what you already do, but we've got to think, can we deliver the equivalent of non-invasive therapy, giving the outcomes that clients want, but using an entirely different mechanism? So that's the second challenge of innovation. And innovation is a term I use to allow us to do things that previously weren't possible without technology. Third is elimination, which is the idea of preventative health. So what about preventative legal work, where we can work in dispute avoidance rather than dispute resolution, on legal risk management rather than legal problem solving. And that's about eliminating the problems to which lawyers are today's best answer. So I say a richer view of the future is not simply this well-worn debate about what lawyers do that can be replaced by machines. We have to make the leap and talk about the equivalent of non-invasive therapy and preventative medicine. And in that context, it seems to me that a lot of the discussion about the future of jobs are far too limited. And I know a lot of people will say that when you use a technology, new jobs arise. And of course, we've seen evidence of that. But what Dan and I point out in our book is that there's no evidence that the new jobs that are going to arise are jobs for which humans are better placed than machines. That's to say, new jobs are going to arrive, but machines are probably going to take them on too. But we shouldn't think about this in too narrow a sense as people have done today about automation. You've got to think about innovation and elimination. And I don't think we've got the economic models for that. I don't think we've got the experience of it. I think the paradoxes disappear when you widen your thinking in that way. And I also think for many of these technologies, it's just too early. I use the example in my book of the ATM. And it's a good example of innovation in a way, because what didn't happen, it wasn't the case that 50 years ago in the middle of the night, when someone needed money, you went down to the local bank and there was a hole in the wall and you said, "Could I have some money, please?" And some poor guy sitting there hands out the money. It wasn't that process existed and some bankers got around the table and said,
Right.
"Come on, chaps, that's rather inefficient and often quite chilly. Why don't we do it in a different way?" Of course not. It was that this technology enabled an entirely new way of delivering the domestic banking service. And that was a form of innovation. But of course, if you look at elimination now, that's the elimination of cash because of electronic payments. Now, of course, there's new people involved and so forth, but it's very hard to imagine, say, in 10 or 15 years in financial services, that it's going to look like the bank teller sitting in the bank. There will be new jobs. Some of these will be taken on by machines. But I think what we're seeing is a general move away from all tasks and activities being undertaken by humans with their remarkable brains towards AI. And I'm not convinced we've actually got the ways of measuring what that means for us in economic terms, both within smaller organizations and a macro level economically too. It's quite interesting that in the world of economics, they seem to be divided about whether or not AI will give rise to greater productivity. Two Nobel Prize winners, for example, completely disagree with this. Michael Spence over this. Michael Spence thinks that there will be a massive increase in productivity. Darren Acemoglu thinks entirely the reverse. So we're feeling our way. But I find it hard seeing what I'm seeing in organizations that are already deriving benefits from these systems. One client who says, for example, in their legal teams who are using this systems, that they're saving 3 hours a week. Now, it's early days, and that's almost half a day a week. If we extrapolate forward, we can imagine a very substantial impact on the work of lawyers, and that's just automation. What was going to be fascinating is see how the startup industries come through with the equivalent of non-invasive therapy and come through with preventative medicine, legal risk management. Fascinates me the idea that we will be able to have bots and agents roaming around client organizations, identifying early indications of legal problems and legal difficulties, putting that fence at the top of the cliff rather than the ambulance at the bottom.
Absolutely. The future is bright and unknown, and we're discovering it every day. And I truly think
to be alive, to be seriously, to be involved in this breakthrough set of technologies on this pivotal, defining moment for humanity, where we're at the threshold of something that is phenomenally powerful, and I think can be applied for good and bad. I mean, you'll see, I say in the book that saving humanity with and from AI, I believe, is the defining challenge of our age. But what a time to be looking at this defining moment.
truly. And I really want to say on behalf of everyone, thank you so much for giving us this book so that we can have a better way of filtering through our minds how to think about AI, because it truly is the challenge of our time.
That's so kind of you. Thank you.
Well, with that, I do want to ask you a couple of questions that I ask all of my guests.
Okay.
The first one is that clearly you have a lot that you do. You have a lot of irons in the fire. I'm sure that you appeared on many different podcasts that you know are continually writing and thinking about these things. The developments come out almost hourly when it comes to AI innovation. How do you keep on top of things? Is there a work-life balance? Do you reject the premise that there is one? What do you think?
There's a few things there. I like to keep on top of things. I'm a huge reader, so I'm always reading books, always reading updates, and I've got some great clients I work with, and I learn from them and I see how technology is evolving with them. But I'm plugged into all sorts of interesting groups, and it's difficult now. At one stage, for example, I pretty much knew every legal tech company in the world. Now I think there are 3 or 4 thousand. It's very hard to keep track of them. So you do your best and you filter. And again, AI is coming to help here because we have AI systems that can undertake deep research for us and keep us up to date. The work-life balance has always been interesting, and I do get a great deal of pleasure out of my work. I'm so lucky in that. I know so many people don't enjoy what they do, and their work and lives are miserable because of the toil of their work. And I'm completely the reverse. I'm completely fired up about it. I find it intellectually stimulating. I'm lucky that it gives me a living. I meet some really clever people. I have the chance to advise major organizations and have some kind of impact. And so there's no doubt that my own personality and self esteem and the meaning I derive from my life is very closely related to the work I do. I can equally imagine, though, another world, because many people say, well, imagine there's no work at all. Wouldn't that deprive life of all meaning? I can imagine all sorts of ways of still living a meaningful life, but the path I've chosen is very narrow. I'm a hedgehog rather than a fox in the jargon. I've really specialized in something very particular, and I've enjoyed doing that, and it's part of who I am. So not easy to retire, wouldn't want to, not easy to give up. But it does mean, for example, that I don't have as wide a range of external interests. I mean, I keep fit by running. I enjoy golf. I've got some great friends, but I'm not out socializing every night. I'm not sailing yachts around the world. I fully appreciate that a lot of the time that others would allocate to fun, I have fun in my own way, and that might sound rather geeky, but there it is, and I get a lot of pleasure from it. What's really been important to me, tremendously important to me, though, is always to find time for my family and my children. What's been really good there is I left the law firm I was with in the mid-90s and was the board of the firm. And I remember one weekend we were having 2 weekends in a row with partners meetings, and I just felt, I remember, didn't see my kids, didn't tuck them into bed, and just thought, I'm not sure I want to continue working in this way. So I was lucky in the mid-90s that I was able to go out on my own. But part of my model was to work from home. And in working from home, as I am here just now, my kids have left home now, but when they were here, that meant I was present and we did lots of stuff together. And so if you divide life into your work, your family, and your other activities, and that might be sporting activities or other hobbies and so forth, I think it's quite hard to make a good job of all three. So what I've tended to do is focus on my work and my family. And I can imagine a life where I'd done differently, but that I don't. I mean, you put your finger on it. If your work is a lot of fun for you, you're not really talking about work-life balance. You'll find me, for example, in the garden, relaxing, reading a book in philosophy or AI. And I'm thinking I'm having a good time. Now, I know readers might think this is very limited, but we've all got ways of stimulating ourselves. And so I just seek to feel fulfilled.
Well, I think our definitions of fun are pretty similar. So uh, I think you've anticipated the last question, which is at the end of the day, after all of these pursuits, what makes it worthwhile for you?
And there's a grand thing there, I think, and then there's a more particular thing. The grand thing is, and who knows, but if you can make an impact in this troubled world, then that's a good thing. And what I've always tried to do um, is try and improve the way, and this goes back to my background in jurisprudence, how can we improve legal process? How can we make it more affordable? How can we integrate that into humans' lives so people don't feel alienated from the law? How can it underpin business and government in a smooth and friction-free way? I wanted to do some work that might help promote all of these hopes. And the truth is, it's very hard as one individual to make any kind of impression. But there is some satisfaction when working with governments or working with judiciaries or working with leading professional firms if you can see your ideas playing out. There's no question about that. And there's no question, people ask me, you've been a lone voice for many years. Is it fun now that you've been proven at least partially to be right? And there is no doubt that I don't dwell on it, but it does make me feel quite happy that for 30 years I was in the wilderness and people were saying this guy's nuts. And now a lot of my thinking is fairly mainstream. So that's satisfying. It means to some extent I haven't been wasting my time. But I don't think any of us should overestimate the contribution you make. I always think in life that, and there's very few people who pass this test, a sign of real greatness is when the contribution you made would have been made by no one else. And I'm under no illusions at all. If I hadn't been around, someone else would have been doing the kind of stuff I would do. That's not true of Beethoven or Mozart or Leonardo. And so when any of us thinking we're making a dent in the universe, to use Steve Jobs' term, the reality is we're almost certainly not. But what does matter, I think, is that you feel you're contributing and people find your work helpful, which leads to my second and in some sense more specific and rewarding observation. And that is I get a lot of emails from people saying, thank you for your work. That this inspired me to do X, Y, or Z. I really get a lot of messages. It makes me feel deeply unnerved as well. I think you didn't leave the firm because you read my book, did you? But people have changed their lives, and I get so many notes from people, and more people just thanking me at a particular level for how it helped them make a shift in their career, and how it perhaps my ideas perhaps put them in a different road in life, and that's fun. That's good. That's nice.
That's a lovely way to end this, but I do want to beg to differ with you on one thing, which is I think you have truly made a unique contribution to this, and I can't really see anyone else who would have done it as you have.
Oh, that's really kind of you. Thank you.
And I just want to thank you so much for being on my show. It's an honor to have you on.
No, Tom, the honor's mine, really. As I've said, I've been a distant admirer of your work too, so it's great to chat, even at a distance.
For the benefit of the audience, if they don't know how to get in touch with you or keep apprised of what you're doing, how do they do that?
Through my website, which I don't really keep up to date in terms of discussing my every movement. I'm fairly active in social media, LinkedIn and X, but my website says a little bit about me and how to contact me. And big things I'm doing, I tend to talk about on social media.
Fantastic. And for all of you watching, I want to thank you so much for watching this special edition with Professor Susskind. See you next week. Thank you so much for watching the latest episode of the LaDroid Manifesto podcast. To keep in the loop about upcoming episodes, please subscribe to LaDroid Manifesto and you'll get notified. Thanks for watching. See you next time.